Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for being here in person, and thank you to all of you logging in online. Welcome to the 10th Annual Santa Barbara Botanic Garden Conservation Symposium. And thank you to the Nakashima-Rennie family for their sponsorship today. So I'm Denise Knapp. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at the Botanic Garden, and I'll just be giving an introduction today to the garden briefly and to the islands of the Californias, so just kind of a love letter to the islands. At the Botanic Garden, our mission is to conserve California native plants for the health and well-being of people and the planet. And I wanted to take just a minute to tell you a little bit about what we do in the Conservation and Research Department. We think of the work that we do kind of like the layers of a cake. So the first layer, the foundation, is to understand the nature and evolution of California's plant diversity. This is so important because we need to know what the plants are, how different they are from one another, where they're found, what's rare, what's common, and what communities that they form before we can do really anything to conserve them. When we know what things are rare, especially the things that are rare because of human actions, we work to protect and recover our region's rarest plants. So we do this in a variety of ways. One is just an insurance policy against extinction by adding seed to our conservation seed bank. We do a lot of surveys and monitoring and research to understand what the threats are to these species. And then, of course, we act to recover them, growing them, planting them. And the more recent layer of the cake that we added is to restore Central Coast habitats and food webs. And this work can be research, trying to understand the threats and the best way to restore these habitats. We work to understand the plant-animal interaction so we can really restore the whole food webs and not just garden with plants. And then, of course, just getting the plants in the ground. And the icing on the whole cake is really to advocate for biodiversity and native plants. And that's what we're doing here today. So the garden has been working on the islands for a long time. They've been compared to the Galapagos for their amazing biodiversity and evolutionary stories. And I'm excited to announce this section on our website with Channel Islands resources here. It includes links to all kinds of things like publications on the flora, the vegetation, and the conservation on the islands. Some links to reports on the trends and gaps of our species knowledge. And maybe most exciting is links to all of the papers in the California Islands Symposia, the first of which was held in 1965 at the Botanic Garden. The next California Islands Symposium is November 6th through 10th, and that will cover all the new research out there, so I hope that you'll sign up for that after this day too. So the islands that I'm talking about today are primarily 8 islands off the coast of Southern California and another 8 off the coast of Baja California. And as you can see, they range quite a bit in size. So just a tour through some of these islands. They all have their own unique character and beauty. Santa Barbara Island in this picture is the smallest of the California Channel Islands, and its volcanic cliffs have great nooks and crannies for seabirds. This is Isla Todos Santos near Ensenada, and it's similarly small, volcanic, and rich in seabirds. Now, in contrast, Santa Rosa Island is one of the larger islands off the California coast and has predominantly sedimentary geology. And you can see the beautiful sandstone layers here, which create some really cool formations like these in Lobo Canyon. Catalina Island is one of the larger islands with some of the most rugged topography, and it has a varied geology, including plenty of metamorphic rocks, some volcanic, and some sedimentary as well. Now, this parent material, these rocks, derive different soil types that support different kinds of plant life on the island. So this is Santa Cruz Island, the largest of the California Channel Islands. And for example, the schist on the south side of the island supports chaparral and island woodland, while the volcanics on the north side support coastal bluffs, scrub, and lots of different rare species. This is Isla San Benito, and you can see a more desert landscape with species of cactus and agave. The California Channel Islands collectively have 110 miles of coastline with many coves, large and small. Some of the more secret caves have been favorites of rum runners and smugglers over the years. This is Isla San Benito again, showing kids from the fishing village there enjoying the calm waters. So wind and fog are frequent features on the islands, especially San Miguel and Santa Rosa Island, which are farther north and more exposed. The winds can be up to 100 miles an hour and heavy fog is common. But this provides really important moisture, especially in the dry summer months. And that supports spectacular arrays of lichens, those fascinating organisms that are a combination of fungi and algae. Millennia of sea level changes have created some really distinct marine terraces, which are especially well developed on San Clemente Island. Painted Cave is found on the northwest coastline of Santa Cruz Island and is one of the largest and deepest sea caves in the world. Named because of its colorful rock types and the algae and lichens, Painted Cave is nearly a quarter-mile long. Between the different currents that merge in the Santa Barbara Channel and the Coriolis effect, there's an upwelling of nutrient-rich water that comes from the ocean floor, and those nutrients support really abundant sea life, including species like giant kelp on the right here off of Anacapa Island, which can grow up to 18 inches per day. Like trees in a forest, these giant algae provide food and shelter for many other organisms, like these fish, which support many pinnipeds. This shows how dense the pinnipeds can get on San Nicolas Island, and even more dense is Point Bennett on San Miguel Island, which can get over 30,000 pinnipeds that haul out at certain times of year. Guadalupe fur seals look more like sea lions with long flippers and external ear flaps. The Guadalupe fur seal was nearly hunted to extinction in the 1880s. So those abundant marine resources also support many seabirds, as seen here on Sutil Islet off of Santa Barbara Island. And it can get kind of intense. This is Point Bennett on San Miguel Island. And you can hear the wind in these videos. So the abundant marine life also supported a thriving population of native people. Estuaries like this one supported shellfish like clams and oysters. So in their own words, this is from the website of the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. The Chumash people once numbered in the tens of thousands and lived along the coasts of California. Through centuries of hardship and abuse, the tribe has overcome all odds in order to thrive on the land of our Chumash ancestors once more. This one canyon on Catalina Island can supply food, medicine, and fiber. So the fruits of California wild rose can be eaten and the petals used for stomach pain. Indian rush in the middle there provides basketry material, and yerba buena provides relief from fever. So the Chumash, who lived on the northern California Channel Islands, and the Tongva, who lived on the southern ones, had some of the most complex early cultures found worldwide, with trade of commodities like soapstone shown on the left and production of art like the sculptures shown on the right. So the Channel Islands are home to the most well-preserved archaeological sites on the Pacific coast, and Santa Rosa Island is home to the oldest dated human remains in North America at 13,000 years before present. Research in the past decade has shown the importance of bulb-producing plants like these blue dicks shown here as a source of important year-round carbohydrates. Dense fields of blue dicks like this were not seen until the non-native animals were removed. There's over 100 plant species not found on the mainland that you can find on the Channel Islands. Clockwise from the upper left, lots of different kinds of lotus, oak, buckwheat, manzanita, live forever, and loco weed, for example. So the island ironwood is an example of a whole genus that's unique to the islands. Ironwoods were once found on the mainland, but now they're restricted to the cooler, moister slopes on the larger islands. These lovely trees also support unique moths like the two shown here. This is island oak, lovely large arborescent oak that thrives in the fog zone on Santa Rosa Island. These are tall trees with big leaves and deep veins. This tall tree is actually called island scrub oak, but it gets taller than any scrub oak that I know from the mainland. It has much smaller leaves than the island oak, though. This is the Torrey pine. It's one of the rarest trees in the world, and this subspecies is only found on Santa Rosa Island. This is the Guadalupe Island palm, only found on Guadalupe Island, and it thrives in the abundant fog on that island. These are manzanitas, which are quite diversified on the islands. Shown here are different species found only on Catalina on the left, only on Santa Rosa in the middle, and only on Santa Cruz on the right. The Santa Rosa one has a special moth that's associated with it too. Now, dandelions are to the California islands as finches are to the Galapagos. So these show that they have evidence of forming different species once they got out to the islands. So these kinds of species are called neo-endemics. There's also a bunch of different lotus plants in the genus Acmaspon, all of them really lovely, but I chose this one to show from Santa Cruz Island because it's one of my favorites. It was quite rare until the animals were removed on that island. There's several types of bush mallow as well. The one on the left is found only on Santa Cruz Island, and the one on the right is found only on San Clemente Island. And there's some longhorn bees that only use mallow flowers. So it takes all kinds to pollinate. And then there's these beauties in the genus Malva. The one on the left is from the California Channel Islands, and the one on the right from the Baja California Islands. Our botanists have recently determined that there are actually 3 subspecies of Malva on the California Channel Islands. Then these are the live-forevers in the genus Dudleya. It's a group that's gone crazy on the islands with a ton of diversity, and this is Green's live-forever. Then this one is San Quintin live-forever, found on Isla San Martin and the adjacent Baja California mainland. And then there's this rare beauty, only found on Cedros Island in the fog zone. Lastly, this even tinier one, Blockman's live-forever, that's on Santa Rosa Island. These different Dudleyas support plenty of pollinators, like the bee on the left and the flower fly on the right. Some bees on San Clemente Island have this super cool rufous color or kind of rusty color. And then there's the island foxes, which are the smallest North American canids and occur only on the California Channel Islands, with a unique subspecies on each of the 6 largest islands. The average weight for an adult is only 5 to 6 pounds, about the size of a house cat. And this is an example of island dwarfism. They are so cute, I needed to show another picture. And it doesn't look like it, but the foxes are actually the apex predator on the California Channel Islands. They're an omnivore, so they eat a lot of things, and they're super key in the ecosystem. For example, they keep the deer mice from getting too abundant. The island spotted skunk is also cute, endemic to the 2 largest California Channel Islands, Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa. And as the only 2 terrestrial carnivores on the islands, these 2, the skunks and the foxes, are natural competitors. When the skunks are threatened, they raise their entire lower body in the air by standing on their front paws. This is the Santa Catalina Island ground squirrel, or beachy ground squirrel. It's only found on Catalina, and it's the largest native herbivore. Catalina is the only island with a burrowing rodent, and this is important because with less ground disturbance on the island, archaeological resources are exceptionally well preserved on the islands. And then there's the island scrub jay, the only fully endemic species at the species level in North America. It's darker blue and it's larger than the mainland species, and it's an example of island gigantism. It's also a really cool evolutionary story, since recent research has shown that the species has evolved divergently within a single population. So scientists have shown that jays in the pines have longer, shallower bills than jays in the oaks, which helps them to access and utilize these different food resources. Each of the Channel Islands is home to an endemic subspecies of deer mouse that's found nowhere else on Earth. In some cases, island deer mice are the only terrestrial mammal occurring on the island. And we can't forget the bugs, although they're way more poorly known than other animals. The Santa Cruz Island flightless katydid is an example of a species that has lost its mobility, which happens recurrently on these islands. Why would anyone want to leave? So perennial water sources are scarce on the islands, but the bigger islands have more fresh water, like this stream on Catalina. These water sources in turn support different kinds of plants and animals, like the Catalina Island shrew, which depends on these riparian habitats. It's one of the most distinct and endangered subspecies of ornate shrew in Southern California and Baja California, Mexico. The islands support all of these species because of all the different environments that support them, different rock and soil types, different slopes and aspects, different amount of moisture. The more complex islands, like Santa Rosa shown here, support more different habitat types like oak woodland, chaparral, coastal sage scrub, and grassland, all found in this picture. On Cedros Island, the fog belt up high supports dense stands of Monterey pine, while drier slopes support drought-tolerant taxa like agaves and cacti. Dry Isla Natividad has a lot of cactus scrub with the super well-defended Coast Cholla in the foreground, and the trident-style cactus is the Mexican giant cardon. This is San Clemente Island, which has the most cactus scrub of the California islands, undoubtedly because it's the hottest and the driest. This plant assemblage is thought to have expanded during the most recent xerothermic period after about 11,000 years ago, so hotter and drier time. We're going to need species like this to adapt to a hotter, drier future. So related to the mallow bees that I showed you earlier, using the bush mallow, are these cactus bees, longhorn bees that specialize on plants in the cactus family. You can see that they're the perfect size to get covered in pollen with those long, beautiful brushes of hairs on their legs to carry it. In the foreground of this picture is coastal scrub dominated by the endemic Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, Eriogonum arborescens. Members of this community often have drought-tolerant characteristics, like going somewhat dormant in the summer months when they need to. This coastal scrub, occupying sandy habitat on Santa Rosa Island, is dominated by silver bush lupin. And this coastal scrub on Anacapa Island is dominated by giant Coreopsis, Leptocyne gigantea. It's distributed all along the Southern California coast, but in few places can you see it in such abundance as you can on the Channel Islands. Now, kind of succulent-y plants with brittle stems like the giant Coreopsis don't stand a chance against introduced animals. In fact, many endemic plants on the islands, like the felt leaf ceanothus on the left and the bush poppy on the right, have larger leaves than their sister plants on the mainland that have lost their defenses against most herbivores. These are like baby salad mix to introduced animals. So now just a few stories that illustrate both the fascinating human history on the islands, but also the abuses that they have withstood over the years. In 1863, George Nightover paid $1,800 to rent about half of San Miguel Island and its livestock. He came to California with the Walker Party in 1834, which was the first party to cross the Sierra Nevada into California. And he built an adobe house in what is now called Nightover Canyon. And then he set about running the sheep ranching establishment with his two sons. From his logs, he says, from my original stock of 45 sheep, 17 cattle, 2 hogs, and 7 horses I had in 1862, I now had 6,000 sheep, 200 cattle, 100 hogs, and 32 horses. Some sources say at one time he had 15,000. Keep in mind this is a 10,000 acre island. And so that's maybe more than 1 per acre, and that's not counting the acres that aren't habitable. Not surprisingly, in the drought of 1863 to 1864, he lost 5,000 sheep, 180 cattle, a few hogs, and 30 horses. About 85% of his sheep. So night ever was carrying about 2 times the load that the island flora could sustain, and animals tore out the plants to their roots. What was once described as lush vegetation was devoid of trees and shrubs, and then without the plants to hold the soil together, the sand blew across the island, forming the pointy sandspit that you can see in the photo on the left. Night ever and his sons then sold their interest to the island, and in 1878, he relates that he's heard the island is almost covered in sand. By the 1880s, the adobe ranch house was abandoned and buried. So these caliche forests are the remains of the roots and the lower trunks of trees from several hundred years ago. What happens to form these is that the roots decompose and then the molds of the roots fill with sand, and then calcium carbonate from the dissolved shells cements these sand-filled molds. So this caliche forest of San Miguel Island was created when strong winds blew away the uncemented sand surrounding those caliche casts and the root sheaths. And what you're seeing is essentially a landscape turned inside out. The roots now stand as forests. So take a minute to let that sink in, how much of that sand was lost, and the plants. Another island now, Santa Barbara Island. In 1916, Alvin and Annie Hyder moved to Santa Barbara Island with their 2 children. They took all the household goods that they would need to build an island life, including lumber to construct a house. They started their existence there in a 2-room structure above Landing Cove, constructed the year before by Alvin and 2 of his brothers. They actually had to anchor it to the ground by cables to prevent it from blowing off the cliff. So you can just barely see that in the photo there. The Hyders devised a wooden sled and a track for hauling supplies. So their determination and work ethic were really admirable. The hauling power was supplied by their horse, Old Dan, and then the sled tracks were attached to the rock by metal spikes that were set in hand-drilled holes in the rock that were filled with cement. They cultivated potatoes and barley hay, and they had heartbreaking failures. They also had trouble with water. It kept getting fouled by the seabirds on the island, and they had to bring much of it from the mainland. They raised sheep, goats, pigs, geese, turkey, and chickens on this tiny island, the smallest of the California Channel Islands, only about a square mile in size. And on their arrival, they found cats and mice, the only animals to be present in enough numbers to be pests. Those had probably been introduced by fishermen and wrecked ships. And they also introduced Belgian hares loose to forage with the intention of creating a local food source. And you all know how rabbits reproduce. They can be very invasive species. So this is Anacapa Island's fisherman hermit, Frenchy Ladreau. I think I would like him to be my uncle. He's one of the island's many cast of characters. His wife died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, and then he sank into a life of drinking and fishing. He sold fish to the passing boats, and his friends brought him food and supplies. He'd entertain them by discussing literature and singing in his tenor voice, and they all told sea stories. He lived in several huts above what is now called Frenchy's Cove, with a colony of semi-wild cats. So bookmark that for a second. This is Anacapa, where frequent frog and increasing boat traffic from the gold rush resulted in more and more shipwrecks. So in the late 1920s, funds were allocated for what would be the last major light station to be built on the West Coast. And the Anacapa Lighthouse was opened in 1932. So at the top of the tower, in the picture in the middle, flashed a Fresnel lens, one of the most advanced lighthouse beacons in the world. So there's over 100 shipwrecks in Channel Islands National Park. One of them, the wreck of the Winfield Scott from 1853, is believed to have been the source of those feral cats, which became Frenchy's friends. In 1939, the U.S. Coast Guard replaced the lighthouse service. The facility was then darkened during World War II and adapted as a coastal lookout station to keep an eye out for enemies. Boats were hooked up to a cable and hoisted out of the water and up the side of the cliff by a boom derrick, and then placed on a custom-made cradle on a rock ledge. this photo my husband John found from National Geographic in the 1960s, and it says, "A blanket of ice plant keeps down the dust," and it does. So that leads to a scene like this, where you see very little diversity in the landscape. And that's because biological invasions are one of the biggest threats to biological diversity, second only to habitat loss. Due to the increase of human commerce and travel, invasive plants disperse about 1,000 times more rapidly than they would under natural conditions. Introduced without their natural enemies that would keep them in check, and then they have these weedy characteristics like high reproduction rates, tolerance to disturbance, fast growth, easy dispersal. They thrive and they push out native species. So we finally get to our awardees who have tackled this threat on the islands of the Californias, opening the door to recovery and securing a future for the island's unique plants and animals. This work takes a village, but there could only be 3 awardees. Usually there's only 1, but we stretched it to 3 this time. And I tried to make a list to honor all the people that are, have been involved in this kind of work, but it was really just sort of impossible to do this, to list everyone who played a role. So I'll present some examples of these roles and some of the people, and I'll ask forgiveness from those who aren't highlighted here. Starting with the botanists, who really raised the early alarm about both the beauty and diversity of these islands, but also the threat of these non-native animals. So Reed Moran wrote The Flora of Guadalupe Island, Mexico, and he says that plants on an oceanic island like Guadalupe have evolved in the absence of herbivores like goats. They've developed no natural defenses against them, and they're particularly vulnerable to them. He says, in parts of the island most visited by goats, such as near the spring, no shrub within reach could withstand them. Hence, shrubs survive only when they're out of reach on cliffs. Robert Thorne worked extensively on Catalina Island, and he wrote this paper where he says, man's really horrendous impact on Catalina came about through his deliberate introduction of sheep, goats, pigs, and deer onto the island. Of 45 indigenous plants reported at one time or another from the island, but now seemingly absent from Catalina, I estimate that man's feral beasts have destroyed 32 of them. Last botanist I'll call out is Peter Raven, who wrote A Flora of San Clemente Island, California. And he says similarly that the large areas have been mostly destroyed by animals, and that the flora that they observed had already, by that time, been profoundly altered. So I also want to call out one of the early trailblazers for this work that we're talking about today, and that's Jan Larson from the US Navy. This article from the San Diego Reader talks about how this work was begun to really protect the plants and animals of San Clemente Island. And he says, in this article, it says, a major effort was underway to protect the island's fragile environment, and some reporters covered the story as if the Navy were using the animals for target practice. The public uproar astonished the Navy and frustrated Jan Larson. It was like I couldn't go to work every day without everybody in the country looking over my shoulder to see what I was doing. Just pointing out the difficulty of this work. So the trackers, the trappers, the hunters are often those who are also the biologists, organizations such as Island Conservation and Institute for Wildlife Studies. They were also often the biologists that were studying and documenting the efforts. Trackers by day, statisticians, and report writers by night. People like Miguel Angel, Peter Schuyler, Rob Klinger, and Dave Garcelon. It's a remarkable range of skills when you think about it. There's the officials, the educators, and the communicators. Those biologists have bosses and colleagues who also take the hit when things get controversial. People like Russell Gallipo of the Park Service, Lotus Vermeer of the Nature Conservancy, and Deb Jensen of the Catalina Island Conservancy. And then there are the scientists. So this work is tricky, and no one wants to reinvent the wheel. So learning from other scientists what they worked and what didn't, and what they learned helps others to improve. There's a scientist writing about the big picture, and more than just the technical and logistical aspects, a lot of financial, political, communications, and legal preparation to be done, and then teaching others through their papers. And then, of course, documenting the recovery, which we'll hear a lot more about today. So finally, congratulations to our 2023 John C. Pritzloff Conservation Awardees, Peter Schuyler, Grupo de Ecología y Conservación de Islas, and Kate Faulkner. So we got together to celebrate last night for a speaker dinner, and we presented them these vases inscribed with the award, with some native plants in them. So congratulations again. And that is the end of that presentation. Now I will show you this video that we made for them. This work definitely takes a village, but we chose these three entities this year because each of them was responsible for removing multiple introduced animals on multiple islands, and it paid off. Lots of recovery, lots of species showing up that hadn't been seen in a long time, things that were presumed extinct, new species that we didn't know were on the islands all popping up. Few people would be able to make an impact like they did.
First time I went to Guadalupe Island was in 1979, and there were 30,000 goats on the island, and there were vast areas of barren land with no vegetation whatsoever.
SA's number one accomplishment on Guadalupe Island, in my mind, is getting rid of the feral goats on Guadalupe.
Mi nombre es Israel Popoca, trabajo en la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas. Ahorita estamos en la Reserva de la Biosfera Isla Guadalupe, donde hemos realizado trabajos de conservación de islas y erradicación junto con GESI. En Isla Guadalupe es un ejemplo de erradicación de especies invasoras, de especies exóticas, como por ejemplo la cabra, ¿no? Donde había miles y miles de cabras que fueron erradicadas hasta el 2007.
I started working with them about 20 years ago, just when they were starting to get going as a separate organization. And just in the last 2 decades, the amount of conservation that they've gotten done in Mexico across the islands, not only on the Baja California islands, but really across Mexico and the Gulf of California and other islands across Mexico, is truly remarkable.
They've come up with really ingenious ways to deal with feral animals in a really rugged landscape.
And now there are fern thickets where it's, I'm 6'8", and so these things are almost as tall as me, and it's ferns, and it's just a thicket of ferns, and the vegetation recovers, and it's like something nobody's ever seen before because nobody has seen it since the animals were there.
Y pues un reconocimiento a GESI por todos estos esfuerzos en las islas de México para erradicación de especies y sobre todo en Isla Guadalupe.
I have been working with Kate for about 24 years. I met her in 1992 when I came out to the park for an interview, and we flew out to all of the park islands in one day on a helicopter, which was quite a trip for me, having been a graduate student with no money to do that kind of stuff. We talked about the condition of the islands, what kinds of research would need to be done to help understand what's going on, but also we talked a lot about the management implications of removing animals. And I remember thinking about what an enormous task that was going to be, but she pulled it off.
One of Kate's fantastic qualities is taking the long view and also persevering with extremely complex projects. A lot of these efforts to remove ungulates, non-native animals from the islands require endless amount of time and energy navigating complex permitting issues. The logistics alone of executing these things on islands is something that requires immense effort and the ability to adapt A lot of folks were not fond of some of these efforts, and you also have to be able to liaison it and educate the public in terms of why this is important. You know, why is removing animals sometimes lethally really required? And Kate, definitely utilized data and information, and also really was able to push and garner support under, many times adverse situations.
None of this recovery work that we're doing now, the restoration projects that we're working on now, were possible while the animals were here. And so really, she set the stage to move forward in the next few decades with the restoration projects on the islands.
It was really her level of commitment that got us to where we are today. And I think it gives me motivation to continue to try and carry on that legacy.
Peter has done amazing work on Santa Cruz Island. There are no roads on the north side of Santa Cruz Island. He was able to hike up there every day and not only work on getting rid of the feral animals, but also documenting the rare plants and other important resources that he was seeing as he was hunting.
Peter came to the Conservancy as the Director of Ecological Restoration. Between the goats and the boar, they were destroying our native plants. And we were very thankful that Peter came to us at a time when we were trying to figure out how best to combat that and how to bring Catalina back to what it once was.
Everybody that kind of goes to Catalina or has been a part of Catalina feels that Catalina is them, and we get that. And so yes, he had the major challenges that probably other people in charge of science on the other islands did not have to deal with.
We had the local people who had, many of them, grown up with the goats, and they're cute. Then you had the animal rights activists and other groups that call themselves environmentalists, and they are, but in a totally different way than what we were trying to do. Peter was strong enough to withstand all of that and to help us stay the course as we went along.
Living amongst a community that doesn't want you to do the conservation work that you're doing, that takes courage. And to know that the fruits of that labor might come 20, 30 years after the work you've done, that says something about his dedication and his understanding of how the ecosystems work and the partnerships that it takes to carry out that work.
Peter has a great combination of being down to earth, being passionate about the world, and also having the scientific background and the scientific know-how to justify what he's doing and to explain it to others.
All of these individuals and entities just really knows how important this work is and how special these ecosystems are. It's not easy to picture just how hard this work is and how kind of controversial that it is in the moment, and just how strong these people need to be to continue on.